Two baby twins fall into critical condition, and doctors say they have only 2 hours to live. The wealthy and influential father watches helplessly, unaware that he is about to regain everything he once lost. Suddenly, a housemaid steps into the room and does the unthinkable, revealing a secret from the past no one ever imagined. What happens next defies medicine, uncovers buried truths, and forever changes the fate of an entire family. Before we begin this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like on the video, which is very important to us, and tell us which city you're watching from. The silence in Holy Cross Hospital seemed heavier in the early hours of that Tuesday morning. The corridors, normally bustling even in the dead of night, were strangely empty, as if even the institutional life sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen. It was 2:15 in the morning when Richard Mason walked through the automatic doors of the emergency room, his steps echoing against the cold, white, marble floor. His clothes still carried the scent of cold coffee and printed papers, evidence of another sleepless night at the office, trying to escape a reality that insisted on finding him. At 42, Richard had built an empire in the real estate business. Buildings bearing his architectural signature dotted the London landscape, and his name was synonymous with success in the business pages of the newspapers. But none of that mattered now. None of it had mattered since Marina left 11 months ago, leaving him alone with 2 babies he barely knew how to hold in his arms. Call had come at 2 in the morning. Helen, her voice on the other end of the line, trembling in a way he had never heard before. "Mr. Mason, you need to come to the hospital now. It's about Gabriel and Raphael. They can't breathe properly. I'm at Holy Cross." Helen Adams, the woman who had been taking care of his home for 3 years, who prepared the boys' bottles, who rocked them to sleep when they cried in the middle of the night, who occupied all the spaces he couldn't fill. A discreet, almost invisible but constant presence. He knew so little about her. He knew she was punctual, dedicated, that the boys smiled when they saw her. He knew that Marina had hired her personally, shortly before discovering she wouldn't have much time to raise the children she had so desperately wanted. But Richard had never bothered to get to know her beyond that. To him, Helen was just another efficient employee in his organized and compartmentalized life. Now, standing before the hospital reception, Richard felt his legs trembling. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with glasses hanging around her neck, watched him with a mixture of recognition and compassion. He was known here. He had made a significant donation to the pediatric wing 2 years earlier, when Marina was still alive and they dreamed of having a large family. "Mr. Mason," she said softly, "they're waiting for you on the 4th floor. Dr. Beatrice Chambers is looking after your boys." The elevator ascended slowly, and Richard watched the numbers change on the digital display. 4th floor. Neonatal intensive care unit. Every second seemed eternal, and he felt his heart pounding erratically in his chest. When the doors opened, the characteristic hospital smell, disinfectant mixed with something he couldn't identify, perhaps hope mixed with despair, overwhelmed his senses. Helen was there, sitting in one of the blue plastic chairs in the hallway, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. When she saw him, she stood up quickly, and for the first time, Richard noticed she was younger than he had imagined, perhaps 35, with brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a white blouse and jeans. Nothing about her was remarkable, except for her eyes. There was something in her eyes, a depth he had never noticed before. "Mr. Mason," she said, approaching him. "They started with a low fever yesterday afternoon. I thought it was something normal, you know how it is with babies. But during the night, their breathing became difficult, very difficult. I brought them here an hour ago." He wanted to ask why she hadn't called sooner, but the words wouldn't come out. In truth, a part of him knew the answer. He had made it clear since Marina's death that he didn't want to be bothered with the details of raising the children. He had significantly increased Helen's salary, given her carte blanche to make all necessary decisions, and had taken refuge in his work. The boys had everything they needed, the best food, the best clothes, the best medical care. He just wasn't present for any of it. "Where are they now?" he asked, his voice coming out hoarser than he intended. "In room 3. Dr. Chambers is with them. She wants to talk to you." Richard followed Helen down the corridor, noticing for the first time how she walked, with firm yet careful steps, like someone accustomed to carrying precious things. They stopped in front of a glass door, and through it, Richard could see two small cribs surrounded by equipment. Gabriel and Raphael, his 11-month-old sons, were connected to tubes and wires, artificial respirators moving their tiny chests up and down in a mechanical rhythm that sounded like a death sentence. Just then, Dr. Chambers appeared, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and a grave expression. She gestured for Richard to follow her into a small side room, leaving Helen outside. "Mr. Mason," the doctor began, closing the door behind them. "I need to be direct. The boy's lungs are failing simultaneously. It's something I've never seen before in twins this age. We've run every possible test, applied every protocol, but the situation is critical." Richard sat down heavily in one of the chairs, his legs finally giving way. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means we have very little time, perhaps 2 hours at most. We're doing everything we can, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think it would be important for you to be near them now." 2 hours. The words echoed in Richard's head like a sinister gong. 2 hours to say goodbye to sons he barely knew. 2 hours to accept that he had failed completely as a father. 2 hours to understand that the only person who had truly loved Gabriel and Raphael for the past 11 months was outside, waiting in the hallway. When he returned to Helen's side, she looked at him with a silent question in her eyes. He couldn't speak. He just pointed to the glass door, and they both stood there watching the two small lives fighting against machines that did the work their bodies could no longer perform. "Can I go in?" Helen asked after a few minutes. "Visitors aren't allowed in the NICU," Richard replied automatically, repeating what the nurse had explained. "I know," Helen said softly, "but they know me. They know who I am." There was something in the way she said it that made Richard look at her more closely. It wasn't just an employee talking about children under her care. It was something deeper, more visceral, like a mother talking about her own children. "Mr. Mason," Helen continued, "may I ask you a question?" He nodded, unable to speak. "Have you ever held them, since they were born?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. The answer was no. He had held the boys few times right after they were born, when Marina was still alive to guide him. But after she died, he had convinced himself it was better to leave their care to someone more experienced, someone who didn't tremble with fear every time they had to change a diaper or prepare a bottle. "Do they know who I am?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Helen didn't answer immediately. She looked at the babies through the glass, and Richard saw a tear run down her face. "They know who loves them," she said finally. In that moment, all the defenses Richard had built around himself crumbled. He leaned against the hallway wall and began to cry. Not the restrained cry of a businessman accustomed to controlling his emotions, but the devastating sob of someone who had just realized he had lost much more than a wife. He had lost the chance to be a father to his own sons. Helen approached and, hesitantly, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Mason, there's still time." 2 hours, he said between sobs. 2 hours isn't time for anything. "It's time to be present," Helen replied. "It's time for them to know their father is here." But as they spoke, alarms began to sound in room 3. Red lights flashed on the monitors, and the medical team rushed in. Through the glass, Richard saw Dr. Chambers working frantically over one of the cribs. He couldn't tell if it was Gabriel or Raphael. A nurse came out of the room and approached them. "Dr. Chambers asked me to inform you that it might be best to prepare yourselves. Their vital signs are dropping very rapidly." Richard felt the world spin around him. This was it then. He was going to lose his sons the same way he had lost Marina, watching from a distance helpless as life slipped through his fingers. But Helen had moved away from him and was walking determinedly toward room 3. When the nurse tried to stop her, she said something Richard couldn't hear clearly, but it made the staff member step back in confusion. "Wait," Richard called out. "What are you doing?" Helen stopped at the door and turned to him. For a moment, Richard saw something different in her face, a determination that went far beyond the dedication of an employee. a pain that mirrored his own, and a competence he had never perceived before. "Mr. Mason," she said, her voice firm despite her tears, "there are things about me you don't know. Things you probably should have asked about a long time ago." And with that, she pushed open the door to room 3 and disappeared inside, leaving Richard alone in the hallway, watching through the glass as his entire life changed forever. What happened inside room 3 in the following minutes was something the medical staff at Holy Cross Hospital would never forget. Richard remained glued to the glass, his heart pounding so hard he could feel the pulse in his temples, watching a scene that seemed surreal. Helen had entered the room with a confidence that didn't match the shy, reserved woman he knew. The nurse who had tried to stop her at the door was now leaning against the wall, mouth agape, as Helen addressed Dr. Chambers directly. "Doctor, I need you to listen to me," Helen said, her voice firm and professional. "My name is Helen Adams, GMC number 52847 London. I am a specialist in neonatology with 15 years of experience in the NICU. I have a proposal." Dr. Chambers stopped what she was doing and looked at Helen as if she had just spoken in another language. "I'm sorry, but who are you? How did you get in here?" "I've been caring for these babies for 11 months, Helen replied, approaching the cribs, "and I know exactly what's happening to them. It's simultaneous respiratory distress syndrome. I've seen it before in premature twins who have undergone severe emotional stress." Richard felt the floor sway beneath his feet. Helen was a doctor? How was that possible? Why was she working as a housekeeper if she was a specialist in neonatal medicine? "Look, Ma'am," Dr. Chambers began, but Helen interrupted her. "Please, we don't have time for bureaucracy. Look at the monitors. The oxygen saturation is dropping rapidly in both of them. They're not responding to mechanical ventilation because the problem isn't just physiological. It's emotional. They feel their mother's absence, they feel their father's distance, and their bodies are shutting down." "That's impossible," the doctor said, but there was uncertainty in her voice. 11-month-old babies don't have that level of emotional awareness." "Twins do," Helen retorted, already moving toward the first crib. "Especially twins who lost their mother and were deprived of paternal contact. They feed off the bond with each other and with those who love them. When that bond is threatened, they can enter a spiral of decline that no machine can reverse." Outside, Richard was mesmerized. The woman he saw every day preparing bottles and folding clothes was speaking like an expert. Every word that came out of her mouth demonstrated a profound knowledge she had hidden from him all this time. "What do you propose?" Dr. Chambers asked, and Richard could see that, despite her skepticism, she was willing to listen. The equipment continued to blare alarms, and it was obvious that conventional treatments were not working. "Modified kangaroo care," Helen said, already starting to disconnect some of the tubes from the first crib. "I'm going to position them skin to skin with me, allowing them to feel human warmth, a regular heartbeat, and natural breathing. It's a method that works on preemies, but it's never been tested in a situation this extreme." "You can't do that," the nurse protested. "You're not authorized. You're not part of the team." "Beatrice," Helen addressed the head doctor directly, "do you know me?" The doctor observed her for a few seconds, frowning. "You look familiar, but British Congress of Neonatology 2018, my presentation on respiratory distress syndrome in twins. You asked a question about the influence of the emotional environment on treatment response." Dr. Chambers' face changed completely. "Helen Adams. You're the Helen Adams who published that research on emotional bonds in the NICU? But you disappeared from medicine years ago." "Yes," Helen said simply. "I disappeared, but not today. Today I need to be here." Without waiting for further permission, Helen began to carefully remove Gabriel from all non-essential equipment, keeping only a basic heart monitor. The baby was pale, his lips bluish, his breathing irregular and shallow. Richard watched as Helen sat in a chair near the cribs and unbuttoned her blouse, exposing her bare chest. With precise and gentle movements, she positioned Gabriel against her skin so that the baby's ear was directly over her heart. "Come here, my love," she whispered to Gabriel, a tenderness in her voice that Richard had never heard before. "Helen is here. You're not alone." The effect was almost immediate. Gabriel's heart monitor, which had been emitting irregular and worrying beeps, began to stabilize. The baby's breathing, previously gasping and desperate, started to synchronize with Helen's. "My God," murmured the nurse. "Quickly," Helen said to Dr. Chambers. "Bring Raphael. They need to be together." The doctor, now completely engrossed in what she was witnessing, quickly brought Raphael and positioned him next to Gabriel, also in direct contact with Helen's skin. The two babies, who minutes before had been on the brink of death, began to visibly calm down. Richard couldn't believe what he was seeing. Gabriel stretched out a tiny hand and found Raphael's little arm. Their minuscule fingers intertwined, and their breaths synchronized not only with Helen's but with each other's. "How did you know?" Dr. Chambers asked, her voice full of admiration. "Because I've lost a baby like this before," Helen answered, tears streaming down her face as she gently stroked Gabriel and Raphael's heads. "My daughter Sophia. She died at 6 months old in a NICU because I was so focused on the medicine that I forgot she needed love, not just treatment." The silence in the room was profound. Only the sound of the monitors, now emitting regular and reassuring beeps, broke the quiet. "After I lost Sophia," Helen continued, "I couldn't practice medicine anymore. Every baby I saw reminded me of her. Every cry broke my heart, so I stopped. I became a caregiver for the elderly, then a housekeeper I thought I could forget." "But Marina found you," Dr. Chambers said, and it was more of a statement than a question. Richard started. "How did the doctor know about Marina?" "Marina Mason was your wife, wasn't she?" Dr. Chambers turned toward the glass, knowing Richard was listening. "She came here several times during her pregnancy. She always asked about the best way to ensure the babies had specialized care. She said she was looking for someone special to look after them." Helen nodded, adjusting Gabriel and Raphael in her arms. The babies were now rosy-cheeked, breathing naturally, and for the first time in months, Richard saw them truly at peace. "She found me through a mutual friend," Helen explained. "I was working as a caregiver for that friend's grandmother. Marina found out about my medical background and sought me out. She said she knew she wouldn't have much time to raise her children and wanted someone who could love them as a mother loves, but with the knowledge to protect them as a doctor protects." Richard leaned against the hallway wall, feeling his legs weaken again. Marina knew. His wife had planned everything. She had found Helen on purpose, knowing exactly who she was and what she would be capable of. "Why did you never tell me?" he murmured to the glass, knowing Helen couldn't hear him. But it was as if she had heard his thoughts. Helen looked toward the glass, her eyes meeting Richard's for the first time that night. "Because Marina asked me to let you find out for yourself when you were ready," she said loud enough for him to hear through the door. "She said you needed time to process her loss before you could accept that someone else could love the boys." The monitors continued to emit stable, comforting sounds. Gabriel and Raphael slept deeply on Helen's chest, their breaths synchronized, their small bodies finally relaxed. Dr. Chambers checked their vital signs and shook her head in admiration. "I've never seen anything like it. Oxygen saturation is at normal levels, heartbeats are regular, blood pressure has stabilized." "How long do they need to stay like this?" the nurse asked. "A few hours," Helen replied. "Maybe all night. They need to feel that they are safe, that someone is taking care of them, that they won't be abandoned again." Just then, the door to the room opened and a man in a suit appeared, accompanied by 2 hospital security guards. Richard recognized the type, a hospital administrator, probably the medical director. "Dr. Chambers," the man said with authority, "we received a report that an unauthorized person is performing medical procedures in this room. We need to stop this immediately." "Dr. Thompson," Dr. Chambers stood up. "Please look at the monitors. This intervention saved these children's lives." "That's irrelevant," Dr. Thompson replied. "We have protocols to follow. This person is not part of our clinical staff and is not authorized to be here, let alone perform any kind of treatment." Helen remained still, holding Gabriel and Raphael, but Richard could see the tension in her face. "Doctor," she said calmly, "can I stay like this for a few more hours? They are still stabilizing." "Absolutely not. You need to leave this hospital immediately. or we will call the police." It was then that Richard finally reacted. He pushed open the door and entered the room, still in his pajamas and robe, his eyes red from crying. "One moment," he said, his voice firm despite his emotion. "These are my sons, and this woman just saved them when conventional medicine had given up on them." "Mr. Mason," Dr. Thompson said in a more respectful tone, "I understand your gratitude, but we have rules." "Your rules nearly killed my sons," Richard interrupted. "Look at them. Look closely. 2 hours ago, you told me they had minutes to live. Now they are breathing naturally, sleeping peacefully. How do you explain that?" Dr. Thompson looked at the monitors, clearly uncomfortable with the fact that he couldn't deny the obvious. "Even so," he insisted, "this person must be removed. We can transfer the children to other equipment." "No," Helen said firmly. "If you move them now, they will panic again. The bond we've created is still fragile. It needs a few more hours to solidify." "I'll take responsibility for her," Richard declared. "If anything goes wrong, I will assume full legal responsibility." Dr. Thompson looked around the room, seeing Dr. Chambers and the nurse clearly on Helen's side, seeing the visibly healthy babies in her arms, seeing the monitors attesting that the medical miracle was real. "Very well," he said finally, "but there will be a full investigation into this incident. This person cannot remain in the hospital after the children are stable." After he left with the guards, silence returned to the room. Richard slowly approached Helen and the boys. "Can I—" he began, hesitating. "Can I touch them?" Helen smiled for the first time that night. "Of course. They're your sons." Richard reached out and gently touched Gabriel's forehead. The baby stirred slightly and, to his surprise, opened his eyes. For a moment, father and son looked directly at each other. "Hi, Gabriel," Richard whispered. "Daddy's here." Gabriel closed his eyes again, but Richard had the impression that this time the baby knew who he was. "Helen," he said, without taking his eyes off his sons, "I need you to tell me everything. About you, about Marina, about the boys. I need to understand how I got so far from being the father they deserve." "After they're completely stable," Helen replied. "Right now, the important thing is for them to know that we are both here, together." And there, in room 3 of Holy Cross Hospital, began a conversation that would change all of their lives forever. A conversation about love, loss, second chances, and how sometimes the person who saves a life is exactly the one we least expect to find. The first hours of the morning arrived with a soft light filtering through the blinds of room 3. Helen remained in the same position since dawn, Gabriel and Raphael sleeping soundly on her chest. The monitors continued to emit reassuring sounds, and for the first time in 11 months, Richard felt a genuine peace as he watched his sons. He had spent the entire night there, sitting in a chair beside Helen, watching every movement of the babies, every change on the monitors. He had tried to talk to her a few times, but Helen insisted they should wait until the boys were completely stable. "Serious conversations can disturb the energy of the room," she had explained. "Babies feel everything." Now in the daylight, Dr. Chambers entered the room to check their vital signs. "Impressive," she murmured, checking the numbers. "Completely normal. Respiration, heart rate, temperature, all within ideal parameters." "Can I move them to their cribs?" Helen asked. "Let's try," the doctor answered, "but slowly. If there's any sign of distress, we'll go back to skin-to-skin contact." With extreme care, Helen first transferred Gabriel to his crib. The baby stirred slightly but continued to sleep. Then it was Raphael's turn. Both remained calm, breathing naturally. "They're through the worst of it," Dr. Chambers declared, "but I want to keep them under observation for at least 48 hours. Just then, the same Dr. Thompson from the previous night appeared at the door, accompanied by a woman Richard didn't know. "Dr. Chambers," the medical director said, "I need to speak with Ms. Helen Adams. This is Dr. Francis Shaw from the hospital's ethics committee." Helen stood, up slowly, adjusting her blouse. Richard noticed she was exhausted but showed no regret for what she had done. "Ms. Adams," Dr. Shaw began, "last night you performed an unauthorized medical procedure in this hospital. Although the outcome was positive, we need to investigate the circumstances." I understand, Helen replied calmly. Do you have an active medical license? My GMC registration was voluntarily suspended 3 years ago, Helen explained. I stopped practicing medicine for personal reasons. Then you have no legal authority to perform any kind of medical intervention. What you did yesterday constitutes the illegal practice of medicine. Richard felt anger rise in his throat. She saved my son's lives when you had already given up on them. Mr. Mason, Dr. Shaw addressed him, we understand your gratitude, but we have protocols to follow. If we allow unauthorized individuals to practice medicine in our hospital, even with good intentions, we would be setting a dangerous precedent. What do you want from her? Richard asked. For now, she needs to leave the hospital. She cannot have any more contact with the patients until the investigation is concluded. Helen nodded, approaching the cribs to say goodbye. She gently kissed Gabriel's forehead, and then Raphael's. I'll leave some written instructions, she said to Richard, about medications, feeding routines, warning signs to watch for. Helen, no, Richard said. You're not going anywhere. They still need you. Mr. Mason, she replied softly, the boys are fine now, and you need to learn to be their father. Those words hit Richard like a slap. She was right, and that hurt more than any criticism he had ever received in business. But I don't know how, he admitted, his voice breaking. I don't know how to hold them, how to calm them when they cry, how to know if they're sick. Then learn, Helen said, but not cruelly. There was kindness in her voice. Marina left some things for you. Maybe it's time to look at them. An hour later, Richard was driving home alone, with Helen beside him in the passenger seat. The babies would stay in the hospital for 2 more days for observation, and for the first time in almost a year, Richard was returning home aware that his life needed to change completely. The house they lived in the Kensington neighborhood had been chosen by Marina. A 1940s building, renovated with care to preserve the original details, but adapted for a modern family. It had a large garden in the back, a ground-floor office where Richard worked when he wasn't in the city centre, and spacious bedrooms upstairs. When they entered, Richard noticed details he hadn't seen in months. Toys organized in specific corners of the living room, diapers folded in perfect stacks on a sideboard, sterilized bottles in the kitchen, the home of a family with twin babies, cared for by someone who loved every detail. Helen, he said, stopping in the living room, where do you sleep? She seemed surprised by the question. In the staff quarters, out back. Can I see? Helen hesitated, but eventually led him to a small room at the back of the house. It was simple, but Richard was shocked by what he found. The walls were covered with photos of Gabriel and Raphael at different ages, from newborns to recent pictures. There was a notebook open on a small desk, with notes about the boys' development, feeding times, reactions to different foods, important milestones. You kept a diary for them, he said, picking up the notebook. I thought one day you might want to know about these things, Helen replied. When Gabriel smiled for the first time, when Raphael started to crawl, when they learned to clap their hands. Richard flipped through the notebook, his heart aching with every page. Here was a detailed record of the first 11 months of his sons' lives, written by the careful hand of a woman he barely knew, but who had dedicated herself to them like a mother. Why did you do this? He asked. Because I know what it's like to lose precious moments and never be able to get them back, Helen answered. And because Marina asked me to make sure nothing was forgotten. Marina asked you to do this? She left me several instructions. Letters, actually. She said I should give them to you when the time was right. Richard felt the air leave his lungs. Letters? What letters? Helen went to the wardrobe and took a thick, yellowed envelope from a drawer with Marina's handwriting on the front. For Richard, when you're ready to be a father. With trembling hands, Richard opened the envelope. There were several smaller letters inside, each marked with a specific date or situation. The first letter said, "To be read when you realize Helen is more than she seems." Richard opened it and began to read aloud. "My love, if you are reading this letter, it means you have finally discovered who Helen really is. I hope it was in a situation where she could show her true abilities, because I know she would never reveal herself willingly. Helen Adams was one of the best neonatologists in the country. She published articles that revolutionized the treatment of premature babies. She saved hundreds of lives. But she carries a pain that I understand well, the pain of a mother who lost a child. I found her taking care of Mrs. Albright, my friend Teresa's mother. When I learned who she was, I understood that God had placed her in my path for a reason. I knew, Richard, that I might not have much time. The doctors were optimistic, but a woman feels these things. I hired Helen not as a housekeeper but as the surrogate mother our sons would need. I asked her not to reveal who she was because I knew you would feel threatened. You've always been proud, my love. You always wanted to be the best at everything. The idea that someone could take better care of your children than you would have scared you. But Helen isn't there to compete with you. She's there to teach you, to show you that being a father isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. It's about loving without fear, caring without hesitation, and accepting that sometimes we need help. I know you'll pull away when I'm gone. I know you'll dive into work and leave the raising of the boys in her hands. It's okay, I understand. You need time to process the loss, to learn, to live without me. But when the time comes, and you will know when it comes, I need you to open your heart. Helen has so much love to give, and our sons need a present father as much as they need a caring mother. Don't be afraid to share the boys' love with her, Richard. Love is not a finite thing that diminishes when it's shared. Love is like a flame that grows when it meets another fire. I love you forever, Marina. Richard finished reading with tears streaming down his face. Helen was sitting on the edge of the bed, also crying. She knew, he said. Marina knew exactly what was going to happen. She made me promise I would care for the boys as if they were my own, Helen said. But she also made me promise that I would never give up on helping you become the father they needed. Richard looked at the other letters in the envelope. There was one marked, "To be read when you feel lost as a father," another that said, "To be read when Helen has to leave," and a third, "To be read when you are ready to start over." "How many times did you want to give me these letters?" he asked. "Every day," Helen admitted, "especially when I saw how the boys were wary of you, how they wouldn't calm down when you tried to comfort them. But Marina said I should wait until you asked for them." Richard stood up and walked to the window of the small room. From there he could see the garden where Helen used to play with the boys on sunny afternoons, where she taught them to take their first steps, where she sang them to sleep. "Last night," he said without turning, "around when you walked into that room and saved them, I didn't just see a dedicated caregiver. I saw a mother fighting for her children." "Because that's what I am to them," Helen replied. "Not biologically, but emotionally. I love them as if they were born from my own body. And they love you the same way." "Yes, but that doesn't mean they don't have room to love their father too. Children have an infinite capacity to love, Richard. The problem is, you never allowed yourself to be present enough for them to know you." Richard turned to her, the weight of the truth finally sinking in. "They don't even know who I am, do they?" Helen hesitated before answering. "They know there's a man who lives in the same house, who sometimes shows up to give a goodnight kiss, who leaves expensive gifts in their room. But no, they don't know who their father is." The words hurt, but Richard knew he needed to hear them. "Helen, what is the hospital going to do to you?" "They'll probably ban me from the premises, maybe start proceedings for the illegal practice of medicine. I might even lose the chance to reactivate my GMC registration in the future. That's unfair. You saved my sons. And I would do it again," Helen said without hesitation. "I don't regret a thing." Richard looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since he'd known her. He saw the dark circles from sleepless nights caring for babies, the calloused hands from hard work, the eyes full of love, and also a deep sadness he had never noticed. "Tell me about Sophia," he said. Helen started. "How? You mentioned her yesterday. Your daughter." Helen closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the courage to speak about something she rarely shared. "Sophia was born premature," she began. 6 months gestation. I was at work when I went into premature labor. As a doctor, I thought I could control everything, that my experience would give me an advantage." She paused, taking a deep breath. Sophia was in the NICU for 4 months. I visited every day, but always in doctor mode, you know? I checked her charts, talked with the team, made sure she was getting the best treatment. But I rarely held her, I rarely just stayed with her. Why? Because I was afraid of getting too attached, afraid that if I loved her too much and she didn't survive, I wouldn't be able to go on. So I kept an emotional distance. I took care of her medicine, but I didn't take care of her heart. Helen began to cry silently. The night she died, I was at home studying new treatment protocols for preemies. The nurse called and said she was declining, but I thought it was just another episode of instability. I said I'd be there in the morning. But Sophia died alone at 4 a.m. with one holding her hand. Richard felt his chest tighten. Helen's story mirrored his own absence with Gabriel and Raphael. After that, I couldn't set foot in a NICU again. Every baby reminded me of her. Every monitor made me relive that night. I stopped practicing medicine and started working with the elderly, then with families as a housekeeper. I thought I could forget. But Marina found you. And she changed everything. When I saw Gabriel and Raphael being born, when I held them for the first time, I understood that Sophia had prepared me for this, that all my pain had a purpose. Richard sat beside her on the bed. Helen, I need you to teach me. I need to learn how to be their father. For real. They'll be wary at first, she warned. They'll cry when you try to comfort them. They'll look for me when they're scared. But if you're patient, I will be. I swear I will be. Helen smiled for the first time since they had arrived home. Then let's start with the basics. How to hold a baby, how to identify the different types of cries, how to prepare a bottle at the right temperature. And you'll stay, even with the problems at the hospital? Helen looked at him for a long moment. Richard, yesterday you saw me as a doctor for the first time. Today you see me as the surrogate mother to your sons. But there's so much more about me that you don't know. I have my own dreams, my own fears, my own life. I know. And I want to know all of it. Why? It was a simple question, but it required an honest answer. Because you saved us, Richard said finally. Not just Gabriel and Raphael last night. You've saved our family for the last 11 months, even when I wasn't present to be a part of it. And now I want to be. I want the 3 of you to know you can count on me. Helen was silent for a few minutes, processing his words. There's another letter, she said finally, pointing to the envelope. One that Marina wrote for me. But she said you should read it too when the time came. Can I read it? Helen nodded, handing him a smaller envelope with Marina's handwriting. For Helen and Richard to read together, they opened the letter and read in silence. My dears, if you are reading this together, it means you have finally understood what I always knew. You were meant to care for these babies together. Helen, you have the knowledge and maternal experience they need. Richard, you have the paternal love and stability they deserve. Do not let pride, fear, or social conventions stop you from building the family that Gabriel and Raphael need. They don't need perfection. They need presence, love, and consistency. Take care of each other too. Helen, help Richard discover the joy of being a father. Richard, protect Helen as she has protected our sons. And remember, family isn't just about blood. It's about choice. It's about being there in the hard times. It's about loving when it's hard to love. You are already a family. You just need to accept it. With all my love, Marina. When they finished reading, they were both crying. But these were different tears now. It wasn't just sadness for the loss of Marina. It was also hope for the future they could build together. Helen, Richard said, when we pick up the boys from the hospital, I want you to come live here as family, not as an employee, as the mother they already know you are. Helen looked at him with surprise. Richard, it's what Marina wanted. It's what the boys need. And it's what I want too. For the first time since Marina had died, Richard felt that his house could once again become a home. 3 days later, Richard was sitting in the boardroom of Holy Cross Hospital, surrounded by a dark, oval wooden table that reflected the seriousness of the moment. Across from him, the hospital's ethics committee had gathered to decide Helen's fate. Dr. Thompson presided over the table, flanked by Dr. Francis Shaw and 4 other members Richard didn't know. Helen sat a few feet away, wearing a simple navy blue suit, her hands folded in her lap, maintaining the same serene dignity she had shown since the beginning of this whole situation. Richard had spent the last 3 days preparing for this moment, not just gathering documents and evidence, but also learning to care for his sons. Helen had insisted on teaching him everything before the hearing took place. How to change diapers without the babies crying, how to tell if they were hungry or just needed attention, how to rock them to sleep. It had been an emotional and practical crash course that opened his eyes to the complexity of being a present father. Gabriel and Raphael had been discharged from the hospital the previous morning, completely recovered. But Richard noticed something that deeply disturbed him. When he tried to comfort them, they cried even harder. When Helen approached, they calmed down instantly. The babies didn't recognize him as a father figure. To them, Helen was the reference for safety and love. This realization had been painful, but also motivating. Richard understood that it wasn't enough to just be physically present. He needed to win back the trust of his own sons. "Mr. Mason," Dr. Thompson began the meeting, "we thank you for your presence. As the father of the children involved in the incident, your perspective is important to our decision." "Dr. Thompson," Richard began, standing up, "before you begin to deliberate on Helen's case, I would like to present some information that I consider relevant." He opened the folder he had brought and took out a series of documents. "First, I would like you to examine the complete curriculum vitae of Dr. Helen Adams." He distributed copies around the table. A graduate of Cambridge with magna cum laude honors, specialization in neonatology at King's College Hospital, author of 17 articles published in international medical journals, responsible for protocols that have saved more than 200 premature babies' lives. The board members examined the documents with growing expressions of surprise. "Second," Richard continued, "I would like you to see this security footage." He had managed to get access to the hospital's recordings through his contacts, and now he was playing the scenes from 3 nights before on a screen, set up in the room. Note the time, 2:15 a.m. Helen had already been at the hospital for 40 minutes when I arrived. She had brought my sons as soon as she realized their condition was serious. She didn't wait for my authorization. She didn't waste time with bureaucracy. She acted as a responsible mother acts. The footage showed Helen running through the corridors, carrying both babies, her expression of controlled desperation evident even through the security camera. "Now look at this moment," Richard pointed to the screen. 2:58 a.m. The medical team has just informed her that Gabriel and Raphael have 2 hours to live at most. Observe Helen's reaction. In the recording, Helen could be seen moving away from the group of doctors, leaning against the hallway wall and whispering something. Richard had managed to get the audio track and turned up the volume. "Not again," Helen's voice echoed in the boardroom. "Please God, not again." "Helen lost a daughter in similar circumstances 3 years ago," Richard explained. "For her, that moment wasn't just about saving 2 unknown babies. It was about facing the deepest trauma of her life and choosing to act, even knowing she could fail again." Dr. Francis Shaw cleared her throat. "Mr. Mason, we understand the emotional situation, but that doesn't change the fact that Miss Adams had no legal authority to—" "Dr. Shaw," Richard interrupted her, "may I ask you a question? If your children were dying and conventional medicine had given up on them, and someone appeared with the knowledge and ability to save them, would you care if that person had the legal authority to act?" The silence in the room was eloquent. Richard continued, "Helen didn't just save my sons from death. She saved them from 11 months of emotional abandonment. While I was hiding in my office, mired in grief and self-pity, she was the one who fed Gabriel and Raphael, who rocked them when they had a fever, who taught them to smile, who recorded every important milestone in their development." He took the notebook Helen had kept about the babies from his folder. "This is a detailed record of every day of my sons' lives. First time they smiled, Gabriel at 2.5 months, Raphael 3 days later. First word, mama, both at 8 months. First time they slept through the night, 10 months. Favorite foods, favorite toys, sleep schedules, reactions to vaccines. It's all here." The board members passed the notebook from hand to hand, flipping through the carefully written pages, illustrated with photos and small drawings. "And me," Richard paused, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't know any of this, because I chose not to be present, because I allowed the pain of losing my wife to be more important than the responsibility of raising my sons." Dr. Thompson leaned forward. "Mr. Mason, we understand your gratitude, but our responsibility is to the hospital's protocols." "Doctor," Richard interrupted him again, "your protocols were killing my sons. Conventional medicine had failed. It took someone with the courage to break the rules to save 2 lives that you had considered lost." "Even so," Dr. Shaw insisted, "we cannot ignore that there was a violation of procedures." It was then that Helen stood up for the first time since the meeting had begun. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. "May I speak?" Dr. Thompson nodded. "Doctors, I did indeed violate hospital regulations. I don't deny it. I acted without authorization, performed a medical procedure without an active license, and disrespected the team's hierarchy." Richard looked at her in surprise. She was incriminating herself. "But," Helen continued, "if I could go back in time, I would do the exact same thing, because there are moments in life when rules become less important than humanity. There are moments when love becomes more powerful than protocols." She walked to the screen where the security footage was still playing. "You want to know why I acted? Because 3 years ago, I let my daughter die alone in a NICU while I was at home studying new protocols. I followed all the rules, respected all the procedures, trusted in conventional medicine. And my daughter died with no one holding her hand." The room was completely silent. "Gabriel and Raphael are not just Richard's sons to me. They are the second chance that life gave me. The chance to do what I didn't do for Sophia. The chance to choose love over fear, presence over protocol." Helen turned to the board. "You can suspend my registration permanently. You can sue me for the illegal practice of medicine, but you cannot change the fact that 2 lives were saved because someone chose to act when the rules were not enough." Dr. Thompson looked at the other board members. There was an exchange of glances that Richard couldn't interpret. "Ms. Adams," he said finally, "we will suspend the meeting for 15 minutes for deliberation." As the board retreated to a private room, Richard approached Helen. "Why did you do that? Why did you incriminate yourself?" "Because it's the truth," she replied. "And because I'm tired of living in fear of the consequences. Medicine taught me a lot about saving lives, but you and the boys taught me something more important, that it's worth risking everything for the ones you love." 15 minutes later, the board returned. Dr. Thompson addressed Helen directly. "Ms. Helen Adams, after deliberation, we have reached a decision. First, the board acknowledges that although there was a violation of hospital protocols, the outcome of your intervention was extraordinary and saved 2 lives that conventional medicine could not preserve." Helen remained impassive, but Richard could see her hands trembling slightly. "Second, after reviewing your professional history and the specific circumstances of the case, Holy Cross Hospital will not only refrain from pressing charges, but will also offer assistance in reactivating your medical registration with the General Medical Council." Richard felt his heart race. "Third, we would like to invite you to lead a seminar on unconventional neonatal care for our medical staff so that other professionals can learn from your experience." Helen was silent for a few seconds, processing what she had just heard. "And finally," Dr. Thompson concluded, "we want to implement a new protocol in the hospital based on your intervention for extreme cases where conventional medicine shows no results. We would like you to help develop it." Helen began, but her voice failed her. "Do you accept?" Dr. Shaw asked, smiling for the first time since Richard had met her. "I accept," Helen whispered, and then more strongly, "I accept." A week later, Richard was in the living room at home, trying to give Raphael a bottle while Gabriel played on the rug next to Helen. It was a scene that had become common in recent days, Richard learning to be a father, while Helen patiently taught him every detail. "Tilt the bottle a little more," Helen instructed. "That way, no air gets in." Raphael finally accepted the bottle, and began to drink peacefully. It was a small but significant victory. With each passing day, the babies were less wary of Richard's presence. "Helen," he said while feeding Raphael, "can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course." "Are you happy here? Living with us, taking care of them with me, being part of our family?" Helen stopped playing with Gabriel and looked at Richard. "Richard, for the past 11 months, this has been the first home where I've felt truly needed. Not just as an employee, but as a person. Gabriel and Raphael gave me purpose again. And you," she hesitated. "Me what?" "You gave me the chance to be a doctor again, to use everything I've learned for something good, something that matters." Gabriel, who was playing in Helen's lap, suddenly looked directly at her and said clearly, "Mommy." Both Richard and Helen froze. "Did he just say—" Richard began. "Mommy," Gabriel repeated, smiling and clapping his hands. Helen started to cry, pulling Gabriel into her arms and hugging him tightly. "I knew this would happen one day," Richard said softly, "and I want you to know that it's okay. More than okay, it's perfect. But you're their father, and you're their mother," Richard completed. "Not biologically, but in every way that matters. And they are lucky to have you." Raphael had finished his bottle and was sleepy in Richard's arms. For the first time, the baby didn't cry when Richard rocked him. Instead, Raphael snuggled against his father's chest and closed his eyes. "Look at that," Helen whispered. "He's recognizing you as his father." "Finally," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "It only took me 11 months to figure out how to do this right." At that moment, the house was quiet and peaceful. Gabriel was asleep on Helen's chest, Raphael in Richard's arms. It was the first time since Marina's death that the house truly felt like a home. "Helen," Richard said after a few minutes, "there's something I need to tell you." "What is it?" "Marina left one last letter, to be read when our family was complete." Helen looked at him curiously as Richard, careful not to wake Raphael, picked up an envelope he had left on the coffee table. "For Richard, Helen, Gabriel, and Raphael, to read together when they are truly a family," was written in Marina's handwriting. Richard opened the letter and began to read in a low voice. "My loves, if you are reading this letter together, it means you have managed to find your way to each other. It means Richard has learned to be the present father I always knew he could be. It means Helen has found the courage to love again after Sophia. And it means Gabriel and Raphael have the family they always deserved. Richard, my love, you have always been a good man, but you were afraid of not being a good enough father. I wanted you to understand that being a father isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. It's about choosing love every day. It's about accepting help when you need it. Helen, my dear friend, you carried the guilt for Sophia's death for too long. I hope Gabriel and Raphael have shown you that you are an extraordinary mother, that your love heals, that your presence saves. Sophia is proud of the mother you have become for these boys. Gabriel and Raphael, my little princes, you were loved from the very first moment. You were planned, wanted, and dreamed of. You had a biological mother who loved you with every fiber of her being, even knowing she might not be able to be with you for long. And now you have a mother of the heart who chose to love you as if you were a part of her, and a father who learned that love isn't about giving expensive things, but about giving time, attention, and presence. The four of you are not just a family. You are proof that true love knows no conventional boundaries. You are proof that family is about choice, about commitment, about being there through the hard times. Take care of each other, love without fear, and always remember, love does not diminish when it is divided. Love grows, multiplies, and strengthens. I will always be with you in Gabriel's laughter, in Raphael's smile, in Helen's care, in Richard's affection, with all my eternal love, Marina. When Richard finished reading, they were all crying. Even Gabriel and Raphael had woken up and were looking at them with that curious expression babies have when they sense something important is happening. "She knew," Helen said, From the very beginning, she knew exactly how it would all end. Not end, Richard corrected, how it would all begin. He looked at Helen, then at the babies, and finally realized that for the first time since Marina's death he was truly at peace. "Helen, I have a proposal for you." "What is it?" "Marry me." The question came out so naturally that even he hadn't expected it, but the moment he said it, he knew it was exactly what he wanted. "Richard," Helen began. "Not as a convenience," he clarified quickly. "Not because we need each other to take care of the children, but because I can't imagine my life, our life, without you. Because you're not just the mother of my sons. You've become essential to me too." Helen was silent for a long moment, looking at Gabriel in her arms, then at Raphael in Richard's. "Marina said I would know when the time was right," she said finally. "And?" "The time is right." "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes." Gabriel chose that exact moment to clap his hands and shout "Mommy!" again, as if approving the decision. Raphael, not wanting to be left out, babbled something that sounded suspiciously like "Daddy." "I think they approve," Richard said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I think so." That night, after the babies were asleep, Richard and Helen sat on the back porch, watching the stars and planning the future. Helen would return to practicing medicine, but now from home as well. She would set up a clinic attached to the house to handle special neonatology cases. Richard would reorganize his business to be more present, delegating more and working less. "You know what's most incredible about this whole story?" Helen said, leaning against Richard's shoulder. "What?" "Marina gave us exactly what we needed. She gave you the chance to learn to be a father. She gave me the chance to be a mother again. She gave Gabriel and Raphael a complete family. And she gave us each other." "Yes, she gave us each other." They sat there in silence, listening to the soft sounds of the London night, knowing that for the first time in a long time, all the pieces of their lives fit together perfectly. Inside the house, Gabriel and Raphael slept soundly in their cribs, surrounded by the love of a family that had been broken by pain but rebuilt by hope. A family that proved that true love is stronger than any social convention, more powerful than any past trauma, and more enduring than any fear of the future. A family that learned that sometimes the one who saves us is exactly the one we least expect to find, and that sometimes the greatest miracle isn't physical healing, but the reunion of souls that were destined to complete each other. Dear listeners, we hope that the journey of Richard, Helen, Gabriel, and Raphael has deeply touched your hearts. This story teaches us that family is not just about blood ties, but about choices of love, about being present in the moments that truly matter. If you were moved by this transformation, by this rebirth of love and hope, please leave your like here, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most. Was it when Helen saved the babies, when Richard discovered Marina's letters, or when Gabriel said "Mommy" for the first time? Every day we bring stories like this that reveal the deepest and truest side of the human soul, that show how love can heal the oldest wounds and build families where we least expect them. We'll be waiting for you here in the next episode, with another story that will stir your feelings and show that miracles happen when we open our hearts to the unexpected.